Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. The worst people you've ever met in your life all seem to be putting themselves forward as candidates for Reform UK. And if Reform can't be bothered to search their social media history for horrific statements, then a lot of people are very happy to do it for them. We'll be asking what Richard Tice's party is actually offering voters and how worried the Tories should be. And then, climate change, nuclear war, or zombies. Why are we so obsessed with how the world could end? My new book, Everything Must Go, The Stories We Tell About the End of the World, is all about that. So for once, I get to answer questions rather than asking them. And in the extra bit for supporters, the Netflix movie Scoop tells the story of Newsnight's famously awkward interview with Prince Andrew. We'll talk about our own experiences with interviewing tricky people. Let's meet this week's three Rhondas. Rhonda 1 is author of The Future of Trust and host of Jam Tomorrow, Ros Taylor. Hi, Ros.
Hello, Dorian.
Rishi Sunak has lost his rag. After days of fuss about a honey trap plot, Tory MP William Ragg resigned the Tory whip himself. The gag going round is that Sunak is so weak that MPs have to sack themselves. What do you think about how the scandal played out? And should he have acted sooner? And do you have any sympathy for Ragg?
I do, actually. I don't normally have much sympathy for William Ragg, but I see what he did and, you know, the banal stupidity of what he did and the fact that forever now he is going to be the bloke, whatever he does next in his life, because he's standing down at the general election, he's going to be that bloke who answered some WhatsApps and, you know, got himself in trouble, which is, you know, a far smaller moral failing than many others, particularly in this government. And yet he will always be that man and he will always carry it with him. It's really pathetic. You know, it's sad an MP could be entrapped and blackmailed in this way. But in the context of things that other MPs have done, handing over some phone numbers is actually not that bad. And clearly there's some score settling going on among Tory MPs like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who are angry about the fact that William Ragg was one of the first movers against Boris Johnson. Right. And so there's all that going on in the background. But mostly I feel, yeah, even slightly sorry for the guy, because this is his life now. This is who he is. And it's just pathetic.
Should he have been sacked?
No, why bother?
Whip removed?
Why bother?
But the fact that he's done it himself, does that then make things look worse? Because you're not...
No, because that shows that he has some appreciation of what he's done. So I think actually that puts him in a slightly better position to have done it himself.
But does it put Sunak in a worse position? Because you're thinking, well, you shouldn't have to wait for him to do it himself.
Yeah, but have you noticed that Sunak's in a pretty bad position already? And of all the problems that he's facing, probably William Ragg is like number 99 on the list.
That's true. Any discussion we have about what could make things worse or better for Sunak just seems rather academic. Next, it's political correspondent for The Independent, Zoe Grünewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
You've been doing some proper reporting at the inquiry into the post office scandal with testimony from Alan Bates, the man made famous by the ITV drama. What did he say?
So Mr. Bates was as punchy as ever. He's a great witness. He's he's been campaigning on this issue for 23 years. So he's been, and he's got first-hand experience of it. You know, he was a sub-postmaster who lost his contract with the post office because they accused him of incorrect accountancy. So he is an incredibly good witness. He's done a lot of work on this and he pulls no punches. So he called the post office an atrocious organisation run by thugs in suits that was willing to do anything and everything to hide the Horizon IT failures. He also said that they basically got rid of his contract with the post office because they branded him as unmanageable because he was refusing to pay back the money they said he owed. But today there's been another session with the post office inquiry with Lord Arbuthnot, who has also been a long-standing advocate for victims of the post office scandal, who has basically been saying that the post office was stringing MPs along the whole time, that Paula Venables was trying to keep information about the post office scandal from MPs, and basically just backing up everything Alan Bates said, that the post office was hiding information from MPs, from campaigners, and from sub-postmasters for many, many years. So this is a scandal that is just not going to go away.
So it's like the bit in Spotlight when Mark Ruffalo goes, they knew, and they let it happen. Is that basically the gist?
If you want me to sum up in just a few words, then that is perfect.
Good,
yeah.
Good. Finally, it's Times columnist and Times radio host, Hugo Rifkind. Hi, Hugo.
Hello.
Government house building is proving a great success in Rwanda. Your paper revealed that 70% of the homes in the Kigali estate that Suella Bran claimed were set aside for asylum seekers have been sold to local residents. I remember when this was announced, didn't you get told off by the actual Home Office for doubting this scheme?
Yes, when Suella Bran went to Rwanda in almost exactly a year ago, March of last year, she posed with all these houses that she said were being built for asylum seekers. And it wasn't like I did sort of like deep journalism on this. I Googled them and I saw that they weren't being built for asylum seekers. They were being sort of built anyway. It was literally just a Kigali housing estate that had been planned for a long, long time.
Right.
That was already on sale. And so I tweeted this and the Home Office phoned me up and said, that's not true. You have to take it down. And I said, in what way is it not true? And they said, well, they are being built for asylum seekers. And I said, I'm going to send you a link that shows you that they're on sale for people who are not asylum seekers, and you can explain to me what I got wrong. And they didn't get back to me. And so that was that. And then suddenly it's a story a year later. And I sort of slightly wish I'd made more of a fuss about it at the time. But there was so much sort of, in a way, it sort of made me, the slight positive spin on this story, right, is that with Suella Bran now not in government, that kind of absolute brazen extreme lying, they don't quite do anymore. They do it 70% now. But it was just so, it was like sort of post-Boris Johnson era, just the Home Secretary going to Africa and saying something that was brazenly not true was a bit kind of like, yeah, that's what they do.
So was this estate, had it been built with British money, or was it simply a regular Rwandan housing estate?
No, it was a regular Rwandan housing estate. I guess what had happened is the Rwandans had said, if we end up housing asylum seekers, once they've been in the various camps that will be keeping them in for 3 to 6 months to process them and everything, this is the sort of place they might end up living. And so the government had went there. And I tried to find out, had the government bought a bit of the housing estate? Was there a deal that had set aside a certain number of houses? All this kind of stuff. There were no answers about that, probably because the answers were no.
I just like the way that they just don't answer when they've been caught out.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting ethical thing because obviously I have the name of the Home Office person from the press department who phoned me up and told me and lied and said I was lying. Had clearly been told to because she seemed to know very little about it. I have not put her name in the public domain. I think that would be a sort of shitty thing to do, but I'm honestly not sure.
The Home Office isn't really famous for "my bad," is it?
Yeah.
That's not their slogan.
Whoops.
What I find really interesting about the Home Office is they're really hard to contact. They don't have a press email anywhere. So you email a contact that you might have and they'll say, not for me, for my colleague. But it's very frustrating because say you want to comment on something quickly, it's actually really hard to get in touch with them and get in touch with the right person. No other government department seems to have that problem.
So there's not an info at homeoffice.
No, not press at homeoffice.co.uk.
Do they have
no.
frequently asked questions? Is your policy working? Yes.
Well, I mean, I speak to them very rarely. Like, I'm essentially a TV critic. What's it got to do with me? I speak to them very rarely. And so I was mildly shocked that they seem to just have my phone number on file. But there we go. They are the Home Office, I suppose.
They've got it all on file.
They've got it all on file.
That's what they do. Let's get started. Reform UK released an early list of its candidates and revealed a freewheeling approach to vetting, i.e. don't do any and let Twitter sort it out. 62 candidates were dumped in the first 2 months alone after their gruesome social media history was exposed by the likes of Hope Not Hate and Sunda Katwala, who is tireless on this subject. Among the lowlights, problematic material coming up, are people who said Africans have the lowest IQs in the world, Ashkenazi Jews are a problem, London is an Islamic state, all Muslims should be forcibly deported, anyone who has settled in the UK since 1997 should be forcibly deported, the BBC and The Guardian should be banned for being subversive, COVID vaccines are a crime against humanity, David Attenborough should be killed, Rishi Sunak isn't British, Tommy Robinson is a patriot, David Icke is right, and meat eaters should turn to cannibalism so as to obliterate the human race. Which is a bold pitch.
Are we against all of those?
And yet my local reform candidate has all kinds of what we could be termed woke flags in her Twitter bio. So what is going on there? I don't understand. It's very peculiar.
Can you imagine being like woke reform?
That
is a very small slice of the spectrum.
I'm waiting for her to knock on my door. And I'm looking forward to having that conversation, Dorian, when she does.
I bet there's quite a lot of, in some ways, woke reform. Because there is, I mean, I always think the most fascinating bit of the sort of political spectrum that you can never really get to grips with because it's incoherent, is that kind of Lib Dem Green UKIP crossover inflection point, which has like they're sort of they're vegetarians but for Hitler reasons. You know, there is that thing going on. So I guess there must be some of them.
Is it also like when everybody accused Donald Trump, or not everybody, some people accused Donald Trump of being a Democratic sleeper agent because it was the perfect way to wipe out the Republicans to put him in office as a Republican candidate, even though he was secretly, trying to get in there for the Democrats. I mean, if you really hated the Conservatives and you were slightly deluded about reform's prospects, maybe you would stand as a woke reform candidate.
Cunning.
I just think there's no end to how weird people's political opinions are. And this kind of basic idea of like, are you on the left or on the right, or are you more in the centre, is just really just the tip of the iceberg of the kind of the jumble of beliefs that people have. So on one level, this is an absolute crank show. On another level, Reform is getting up to 15% in some polls by peeling off angry right-wing voters, but not just right-wing voters, from the Tories, which could make the difference between defeat and wipeout for Rishi Sunak's unhappy crew. So is Reform UK a serious party? Who is it targeting? What is it offering them? And what difference could it make in the next election? Ros, we'll start with you because you've been doing a lot of digging into Reform recently, which must have been a lot of fun.
It was.
The thing is, it is and it isn't a new party. So it's the latest vessel for Farageism after UKIP and the Brexit Party. But what is Farageism without its core project of leaving the European Union? What policies are filling that gap?
Yes, that is their core problem, essentially. Brexit Party was like son of UKIP, and Reform is grandson of UKIP. It's fun. And the other interesting thing about Reform we should mention is that it's not actually registered as a party, which helps from a transparency point of view from their side of things.
What's it registered at? What is it?
It's a company. It's got 4 directors, one of whom is Nigel Farage. It is not currently a party. What are their current policies now that Brexit is done? Well, they're anti-immigration, or rather they want something called net zero immigration. But it's confusing because they don't like net zero. But they do like net zero immigration. So you've got to remember the difference, Dorian.
Okay, immigrants bad, carbon dioxide good.
No, other way around.
No, right?
Oh, right, sorry. No, carbon, yeah,
Hang on,
you're right. God, I'm confusing myself now.
Net zero immigration presumably means people can come as long as the same number of people leave.
Exactly. You've got it in one.
I'm sensing how they could solve this problem.
They could just leave.
Yeah, could just leave. But no, people can come as long as they're highly skilled as well. No low skill. We only want doctors and teachers and so on, and people who we really, really badly need. That's the yes, are only up to create this alleged net zero immigration. And so they're also, of course, as I said, anti-net zero. That's fairly new. And they're really leaning into it now because they saw that it worked a little bit in Uxbridge. So they're picking up on that. They've got a few other policies as well. We heard about a new one on Monday. They want to give you tax relief if you use private healthcare, because the thinking is if you use lots of private healthcare, if lots of people do, it will relieve pressure on the NHS, which is a good thing. They're also promising zero waiting lists. Zero.
They're really obsessed with zero, aren't they?
Yeah, zero's good. It's because nothing must ever change. Everything must always stay the same. And it does look like net zero will be the big election push insofar as we can tell.
Right, because that probably appeals to the conspiracy theorist section of their base as well.
Yeah.
As the angry motorist.
That's what they're hoping, yes.
Do some of these policies misread what Reform voters actually want? I'm going to sort of ask Zoe about her recent piece in the Indie about Tice going, "We are the voice of the working class." Are the working class looking for tax breaks for their private healthcare?
We don't really know if they're voice of the working class. One of the reasons for that is that when you do surveys of them, it tends to be the more middle class members of Reform who actually fill them in, because that's the way surveys work, right? And so Matt Goodwin, the academic, did a big survey of them, which we can talk about later, which came out last week, and he claimed that they were basically equally distributed across all the classes. But then that was merely the people who filled in his survey. I think actually they're not really small state conservatives, a lot of them. A lot of them are quite attached to the NHS and civic pride and things like that. And Reform is also sometimes misjudges its supporters. So, for example, they were very anti-lockdown, and they said we must never lock down again. But Reform voters were quite keen on lockdown.
Well, a lot of them are probably quite old.
Yes.
And didn't want to die of COVID-19.
Yeah, and they didn't see the sort of that they weren't affected by school closures and all that kind of thing. So they were quite keen on it. So there is a mismatch, definitely.
I recently came across a really interesting concept for an American book from the 1970s called the Radical Centre. And it's not the radical centre that Roy Jenkins and Tony Blair talked about. It was for angry, alienated white voters who hated both of the two main parties. Obviously, an American book, but sort of applies in Britain as well. So they're not centrists, but they're looking for a sort of third option. Is that who Reform is targeting? Basically, the sort of damn them all rage vote.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much none of the above. That's how Kieron Pedley at Ipsos described them to me when I talked to him last week. They are so angry. They are really, really angry with Rishi Sunak. They hate him. To the extent that we can discuss later that, one of the delusions, I think, that the Tory party has is that it could, if it had the right policy, get Reform voters back, but they actually hate Sunak. They don't like Starmer either, but they have less reason to dislike Starmer at the moment. I mean, give him time. They're so angry that they probably wouldn't even vote if there was no Reform party. They would just be like, screw them all.
What a loss to democracy that would be. Hugo, Farage isn't currently planning to stand, having failed to become an MP several times. Love him or hate him, he does have a visceral rapport with his base. And I wonder, is Richard Tice really a leader, or is he, as he literally is at the moment, a head of a company? Like, does he have any political skills?
The one time Quentin Letts has made me laugh that I can think of is when he recently described Richard Tice as the chap who looks like a hairdresser, which I thought was quite... I don't know why he looks like a hairdresser, but he weirdly does.
Well, like a celebrity hairdresser.
A celebrity hairdresser,
Like
yeah,
high-end.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Really, really high end. Exactly, yeah. I don't know, there's something kind of there. No, I mean, Richard Tice, he's not a sort of a... He's certainly not a top rank politician. I mean, there's... He's very much smacks of the typical Reform high level thing, which is failed Conservative. Reform is made up of people who, if they'd been better at politics, would have had careers as Conservative MPs. This is a sort of bitter people in the next room party, as UKIP was as well. As for Farage, does Farage have this great connection with his base? I'm not sure, as Ros was saying, I'm not quite sure who his base is. I really, again, this is the big mystery of Reform and Brexit Party and UKIP generally, why it should be that this kind of sort of, city boy that is Farage is supposedly has this great rapport with retired plumbers in the north. I've never quite been able to get my head around it. I expect he will stand if he thinks there is a chance that they will do well if he does, and if he doesn't think that, then he will not stand and then sort of disavow himself of all responsibility for the ensuing fiasco, I think.
Now, as I said, the lively views of some of the candidates seem to contradict Reform Deputy Leader Ben Habib's claim that racism no longer exists. Disappointing. Now, I'm wondering what the logic is here, because Tice says that Reform doesn't have the resources to do proper vetting, and it published its list early in the active hope that the media could help.
Brilliant. Love that. Love it.
Which is just...
I'm going to do that with columns. Yeah. I know everything in this column is wrong, but I'm relying on Twitter to tell me, thank you, my plan is working perfectly.
Let's work together.
Let's work together. It's a team effort.
I mean, is he sort of betting that exposing a lot of racist crackpots and connecting them to the Reform name won't hurt the party's reputation as long as he bins them immediately?
I mean, again, it's like trying to sort of figure out why a dog does a dance, so I couldn't tell you. But I think there is something very weird here, because he will want to jettison people who are going to be embarrassing in certain ways, but he'll also want to be getting voters who do think this stuff. It's not a coincidence.
So you don't lose the cannibals.
Well, quite. But it's not a coincidence.
Red Wall cannibals.
It's not a coincidence that the Nutters end up sort of becoming Reform candidates. It's like there is something that appeals there. There is part of the base that appeals there. There is this sort of vote in being the party that allows, maybe not the cannibals, but that kind of like doesn't denounce people for having what they choose to regard as good common sense views about who we should throw in the sea. So I don't quite think the strategy makes sense. No,
because what I did wonder, if there was indeed a strategy here, is that Lawrence Fox is very angry that these candidates, with their excellent deportee views, have been chucked out. GB News host Connor Tomlinson, in a remarkable tweet, claims that if Tice keeps this up, then there won't be any actual, quote, far-right representation, end quote, at all. And so as Tice gets very litigious, if you call his party far-right, and so this enables him surely to look like the reasonable one if you've got people going, what's wrong with swastikas to your right flank. So I'm wondering whether that's the sort of process, like these are the people that we're getting rid of. And like you say, that will lose some votes.
Well, that assumes that he's got somebody else. that assumes that there's other people. That assumes that there's this constituency of reasonable people who don't like any of these views, who disagree with Lawrence Fox about whatever the fuck he's saying now, all that kind of stuff, and yet are crying out for whatever Richard Tice believes on any given moment that reform offers. I don't know, maybe. I mean, I can't imagine who they'd be.
It's certainly a gamble. Sorry, reform is unlikely to win any seats, but it is very likely to split the right and do Labour a favour. It's warning against Starmageddon, which is a nice link to topic 2. Thank you. But of course, it's effectively working towards exactly that. So what is the strategy? What is a great result for reform?
So Richard Tice has said that phase 1 was always about destroying the Tories, and phase 2 is now about warning people about Starmageddon. And then he had that press conference earlier this week where he spoke about the mine workers' pension scheme. In fact, he brought Lee Anderson in just to talk about it, and then he sent Lee Anderson away again, and it was all kind of slightly strange, and the NHS as well. But the messaging was very incoherent, and I suspect the messaging is incoherent because, as Ros was kind of alluding to, their base is quite incoherent. Although I'm sure their base does stretch across, different sort of economic and class backgrounds, I would wager a large proportion of their base defines themselves as working class. So these might be people who might see themselves as culturally working class, but have had, we would maybe look at them and say, actually, they've got quite a lot of money. They go on nice holidays. And I think part of it is that Richard Tice ultimately what they want is they just want a decent chunk of the vote at the election. They want to damage the Tories. And then I think they are thinking they're going to play the long game on this and target Labour at the next election, take advantage of divisions over net zero, take advantage of divisions over the economy, over immigration, and go for that. But I agree, it all seems, I don't think there is a strategy much beyond that. And I think that is because it is basically a party of incoherence, lots of mixed messaging,
right?
Lots of different aims. And ultimately, the only thing they're all united on and are doing fairly well at is nibbling away at the Conservative vote.
Okay, so bear with me. They're saying we want to destroy the Tory party. Once we've done that, we will become like the official opposition to Labour. Right? That's what they're saying. I would not put money on that scenario. But then what would seem like what a lot of people suspect is their aim is actually to push the Tories to the radical right in the way that, UKIP succeeded in making the Tories kind of a Brexit party. Now, those two things are quite different. Do you want to wreck the Tory party or do you want to transform it? So do you think that's the kind of the secret goal and that they've actually got people that they would swing behind on the Tory right?
I don't know. That's not my feeling from the leadership.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if there are people toying with the idea of joining Reform, Conservative MPs, who are using it as a threat, to their party. So you've got people like Andrea Jenkins, for example. She's not said she's going to join Reform, but you definitely get the sense she's openly flirting with Reform to try and push her party in a certain direction. But I think ultimately what we've seen here with the Conservative Party is they are very divided and possibly could benefit from just splitting in two. There's such a there are MPs within the party who are so fundamentally different from the MP next to them. So you have the really economically liberal and socially liberal MPs who are just like, let people do whatever they want. And then you have the One Nation Tories who are slightly more, I would say, conservative on things like tax and regulation, but tend to be about just being pretty nice to each other and lifting people up,
just
in a sort of conservative way. And then you have the really socially conservative MPs who actually can be a bit more almost what we would say kind of economically left wing, who actually didn't like austerity and, want to see the community band round and look after each other. There's just such a incoherence there. And I think actually the party now is very, very fractured. And Reform might be trying to push, some people in Reform might be trying to push the Conservative Party forward. But I think ultimately Reform is now presenting itself as an alternative for those parts of the Conservative Party that just aren't gelling with what the centre are.
Yeah, because even the phrase pushing the Tory party to the right, it's like, well, which right? Popcon, natcon, whatever con.
Yeah.
I mean,
long con.
The leadership of Reform, if we consider Farage to be the leadership of Reform, which, spiritual leader, I guess, guru, whatever, is low tax, small state. Low tax, small state, low regulation. And it comes back to, it's the whole Brexit, the Brexit incoherence it comes back to, right? That Brexit was a regulation stripping small state project that relied on support from people who want a bigger state and more money. And so that incoherence, it's been in the right ever since the sort of post-Brexit right from the start. It is what it is.
Well, Farage's 60th birthday, which looked amazing.
Were you there?
I mean, obviously they wanted me there. Obviously. No, I mean, I know what the opposite of the great and good is, but that was who was there. And Liz Truss popped up. And again, you're just like, well, hang on, Liz Truss is kind of like maniac Thatcherism. And how does that fit in with some of the more kind of colourful characters? Like the party seemed to sum up like what a weird mess this part of the right is.
I think it's almost, Nigel Farage's birthday was funny because it was almost like a group of everybody who feels personally victimised by Rishi Sunak, or, who feels like they were on
Grudge
the outs.
squad.
And and they were in some way, history has remembered them wrongly. Liz Truss, Nigel Farage, all these people who feel like their vision for the country has not quite been executed, but they'll still get their time. And that is almost what the Conservative Party has become. It's become a group of people who believe that somebody stabbed someone in the back, somebody didn't get a fair shot, the party's gone in the wrong direction, or it's gone in the right direction, but nobody's backing it. It's completely just a party of infighting now. The only thing that really bonds the Conservatives together is the fact that they all kind of hate each other, I think, at this point.
Ros, there are radical right parties across Europe. National Rally in France, AFD in Germany, Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. Such a nice name for a bad party. How is Reform UK different?
Well, they all tend to dislike immigration and they all tend to dislike net zero. Right. So they have those things in common. And of course, in Germany, you've also got an interesting left party, which has emerged as a kind of challenger to the AfD. And that is a populist left party. Sarah Wagenknecht, who is on the populist left. And they may well end up splitting the populist vote, but it's very interesting development because they have quite a lot in common with the AfD, but not everything. But Reform, basically Reform started, its origins lie in Brexit, obviously, as we know. And these parties in Europe tend to be less keen on Brexit because they have seen how Brexit has gone. There was a time when Marine Le Pen wanted to leave the EU, but now very much the aim is to change the EU from within.
Didn't Wilders just drop Nexit?
Yeah,
literally a few days ago.
Exactly, and Viktor Orban is not, he's not interested in leaving the EU. He's interested in changing the EU to make it powerless / focused on his concerns.
Shitting inside the tent.
Yeah, exactly. But the big irony, of course, is that because they are historically all about Brexit, and because most people can now agree that Brexit has been a failure, whether you think that it was always going to be a failure or whether you think that it was badly implemented. And that is like an albatross round their neck now. So there's no easy topic that they're credible on, and what the effect this has is to limit how much support they can get, because Farage is so intrinsically associated with Brexit that every time he comes out there, people are always, a segment of the electorate is always going to say, yeah, well, you wanted Brexit, and look how that turned out. And it's really the huge irony of Reform that was how they got to where they are now, but now it's actually stopping them from getting much further than they are.
Also, the European radical right parties have a frightening amount of support from the young.
Yeah.
Whereas it seems that, Reform, it is mostly old white men. That's the core.
It's a party, as the Conservatives are becoming, it's a party of homeowners without mortgages. It's a good way of sort of basically summing up the demographic. Homeowners without mortgages. So that links the very, very well off with the merely old.
Yeah. As we just noted, Farage is now old enough to claim his senior bus pass. There's no major female figures in the party. Basically, these parties in Europe there are Gen Xers, people like Giorgio Meloni in Italy. There's even Jordan Bardella in France, who is a young millennial, I think. And that really, that enhances their appeal. And this is part of the story around Brexit. Those feel like more modern parties because they have women standing for them more often, and they have younger people standing for them. Reform is just struggling to escape from this aging homeowner, angry bloke.
Well, what these people do not like is immigration. And Matt Goodwin wrote a paper for Legatum saying the Tories could win these people back with a bold offer on immigration. There's a whole world of euphemism within that phrase, bold offer. Is he right? Or is the rage unappeasable? Like, what would you have to do to immigrants in order to please these people that essentially want to destroy the Tory party?
Well, first, let's look at the bold offer, because it is not bold in the slightest. His suggestion is a referendum on bringing net migration down to 100,000. Now, basically, that's been Tory party policy since forever.
Oh, Jesus, an idiot.
Yeah, and it's never happened. So why on earth anybody would think that it is going to happen because there's a
But that's not how
referendum?
immigration works. It's
No.
not. It's a worse idea than the Brexit referendum, which was a bad idea.
Yeah. But it seems the thing is, it seems less immediately cruel than some of the the things that you could say about immigration, and that some Reform candidates are quietly saying about immigration,
Not so quietly, it turns out.
kick out everyone who arrived after 1997. It sounds kind of reasonable, but of course, who the hell wants another referendum? I don't think even Reform voters do. And as I say, who trusts the government to do that if they are instructed to do so? Sunak simply has no credibility on migration. He hasn't stopped the small boats. He has allowed legal migration to rise a lot too. So the idea that the Tories could put across a bold offer which would be believed is, I think, completely for the birds.
I mean, it's sorry, forgive me, but it's fundamentally a split, because this conversation goes round and round. It's very clear how you curb immigration if you want to curb immigration. You curb immigration through an extremely tightly controlled and regulated economy. You do it through making it very hard to engage with the state if you're not born here and you don't have all the required documents and papers. You make it very hard to employ people, very hard to pay people if you're not running through a process system. You basically end up having a very heavily state-controlled society, which is the precise opposite of what the people who generally want to control immigration want. So I think it's very interesting that you're getting this sort of populist left-wing movement in a lot of Europe, because I'd imagine that's sort of threatening to do quite a lot of that. I can't see it ever happening here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all kinds of arguments around it, but I think you need, for a start, something like an ID card system.
Yeah, of course.
To actually enforce the kind of crackdown on illegal working that is one of the drivers of immigration. And there are many, many drivers of immigration in this country, so many. But yeah, you need you need the kind of iron control that is completely
and these people that didn't like lockdown.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Well, precisely.
Yeah. And then there's this tension around business. I mean, we were talking about business earlier. Nominally, Reform is very pro-business. But what you find when things are pro-business is they're actually very pro-migration, because they like hiring people on the cheap and easily, right? So that's another contradiction that's going on.
See, mayhem on the right at the moment. So finally, let's talk about the electoral consequences. We're going to start with people maybe who don't seem very bothered at all from your piece, which is Labour. So this sort of threat to, to say they're going to steal all the working class voters from Labour. What's the problem with that plan?
Well, I think Labour actually, so I was speaking to Labour about this piece, they were just, one of them said to me, we really don't care what Richard Tice is saying today.
I love that.
I think they think of Reform almost as a kind of useful idiot that's going to help split the Tory vote and basically gift Labour a lot more electoral success. I don't think they're at all worried about Richard Tice's new proposition, which is that, Reform are coming for Labour's vote, or Reform are coming for the working class vote. Part of that, of course, is the fact that Labour isn't necessarily the party of the, in inverted commas, working class anymore. There are a lot of Labour's base now is a middle class vote. The other part is that the dividing line, or the indicator, if you're going to move to Reform, is how you voted in the EU referendum. Equally, if you voted Tory in 2019, or if you were previously a Conservative voter at any other time, but you voted to Remain, you're more likely to switch to Labour. So there is quite a lot of clear water between Reform and Labour, which is the EU referendum, that it's going to be really difficult to close.
So Reform will keep basically ex-Labour voters, but the ones that have already been lost over Brexit.
Yes, exactly. So, basically, if you're a Conservative Party voter, you're not happy with the Conservatives, it's all about how you voted in the EU referendum, essentially. And then, of course, we have more and more, increasingly, there's more support for rejoining the EU, or people being sceptical about how our relationship looks with the EU. And then the other fact of the matter is that if you're talking about the working class, I think something that gets ignored a lot, especially by Reform, is actually a large proportion of the working class or are black minority ethnic. And the sort of language that they use to talk about people, black minority ethnic people is obviously quite hostile. So you're very unlikely to get those sort of voters moving towards Reform as well.
Well, in British and American politics, the thing is, working class is always basically white working class. Like that's sort of what working class means. It's sort of really bizarre that they just ignore everybody who was white. So finally, Tories you speak to, how worried are they, given that had the Brexit Party not stood down in a lot of seats in 2019, that would have lost the Tories a lot of seats. Like, how worried are they that it will turn what is always already going to be a defeat into a complete disaster?
I think they're not worried that Reform are going to take their seats, but they're worried that Reform are going to nibble away at the vote.
That's what I mean, yeah.
I think they're also worried that about defections and more the symbolism of people like we spoke about before, Andrew Jenkins or other kind of right-leaning Conservative MPs talking up Reform. I think they think that more Reform hanging around in the background and people giving Reform the time of day is damaging. I don't think they're concerned about actually losing their seats to Reform. They're just concerned about the reputational damage that Reform is doing by constantly attacking them and having people like Nigel Farage speaking. I think they think if Nigel Farage were to stand for Reform, that would be very damaging and would put a lot of pressure from the right of the party onto Sunak to change course, basically.
Well, hopefully talking about Reform has also done a little bit to make things worse for the Tories.
Dorian's latest book, Everything Must Go, The Stories We Tell About the End of the World, is out now and you can buy it by following the link in the show notes. It's an amazing read which takes you all the way from Revelations to Don't Look Up on Netflix. It blew my mind a bit, to be honest. Dorian, was it tough to spend months and months thinking about the end of the world, if not years?
Not as much as you might think, actually. I think for two reasons. One is there's a degree of numbing that takes place, is that if you read one novel about London being ravaged by a plague and everybody tearing themselves apart, and indeed, to continue the theme, a bit of cannibalism, you're like, whoa, this is heavy. If you've read over 100, after a while, you're just like, oh, right, yeah, it's that trope. Okay. Also, everyone in these books is having a much harder time than me. And that sometimes life can be quite difficult, as it can be for all of us. But it's not as difficult as it is for the father in Cormac McCarthy's The Road, for example, who's not got any podcast to do. And so in a weird way, it has that effect with fiction where you go, oh, things maybe aren't that bad. And similarly with nonfiction, some of the stuff that people were saying, literally letters to the Times in like 1954 or whatever, people just going, what's the point of doing anything? Because we could be blown up tomorrow, which is not something I think that we culturally remember about the 1950s, this absolute terror of imminent nuclear annihilation. And so what I hoped to do was to have that same effect with the reader, was not to say there is nothing to worry about, because there are always things to worry about, but that a lot of the most horrific fears did not materialize. And what we're generally facing is many difficult problems in the world, but not the actual end of the world, which is, I mean, that is a really very dramatic scenario. So it's not that surprising it hasn't happened yet.
What's the earliest evidence that we have that humans imagined their own destruction? Clearly, more primitive beings don't imagine their own destruction, and we don't know, the first guy staring into the fire who thought, oh, one day maybe this fire will destroy the world. But what's the earliest that we know of?
Well, the main difference is how you see history. And so a lot of the ancient religions, like a lot of Eastern religions now, see history as time as a wheel, basically. And it is a cycle, for example, as in Hinduism. And the innovation that came from the Zoroastrians was then sort of inherited by Judaism and then, of course, Christianity, is that time is an arrow and it is moving forward. And if it is moving forward in a linear direction, then at some point it is going to end. It just sort of stands to reason. So there are kind of apocalyptic visions, but they wouldn't be called apocalyptic at the time. But they're sort of visions of the end, or the idea of the end. But Revelation is the one where it really is, I mean, it's a berserk piece of writing. I think only when you really get into it do you realize just quite how incoherent and weird and horrifying it is. And that's the one that sort of sticks because it's full of kind of mad imagery and grotesque characters and codes and ciphers and strange numbers. And so that's really become the one that I think we've all in some ways, even subconsciously, inherited.
Yeah, because there's an awful lot of weird shit that didn't make it into the Bible. I remember doing a course on this at university and reading some of the Apocrypha. As
There were
it's known.
endless apocalypses that they were just like, we're not letting this one in. But for some reason, they thought with Revelations, this is fine.
The end of the world is usually a nightmare. I mean, not always if you're one of the chosen, but it's usually a nightmare. But nonetheless, we do seem to revel in it, and we clearly can't stop thinking and talking about it. Why?
So there's a few possible motives here.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is they go, well, people need to sort of, it's almost processing your worst fears. One is that it's projecting your own anxiety about death onto the world itself.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, there are so many different motivations in play, and some people are sort of nihilists and misanthropes, and they kind of would like to see the world destroyed. They would like it just to all be over. And then there are people who, in that sort of classically apocalyptic sense, because the apocalypse isn't the end of the world, for the good guys get, an eternity of good times. So there's those people where they think, well, if there was just this sort of calamitous event, which doesn't actually end the world, but destroys civilization as we know it, and all the people we don't like go, and then it's great for us. So there's that kind of thinking. And then a lot of people, I think, use it as a kind of memento mori, like a kind of what would we miss? And so Station 11, for example, the novel and the TV series, incredible, actually a way of assessing the kind of the everyday miracles that we live with. And I find it really moving and humane that the way that an airport suddenly becomes not a pain in the arse to be stuck in, but this kind of this lost miracle. It's like, oh my God, we could just go up into the sky and we could, there were concession stands, it was duty free. There were like other people, so there's humanists and there's nihilists and there's revolutionaries and there's all these kind of different motives coming together.
So does the prospect of our extinction actually help us to live?
I think it can sharpen your appreciation of life as it is, and that definitely, I think that's kind of the landing point I find in the book. That is the most useful way to think about it. Mm-hmm. In many ways, it doesn't help at all. I definitely found that there was quite a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric in politics and in science, where the sort of research shows that psychologically it's very, it can be very, very negative. I just saw, for example, one of the UN climate change head was saying 2 years to save the world, which seems like, well, this is good. This is going to really spur people into action and it's very urgent. But when that rhetoric is used, what often happens is that the deadline passes and then people either think, well, you were exaggerating and I'm not going to believe you, or they think, well, I do believe you and now it's too late to do anything. And whereas a lot of climate scientists and activists will go, well, look, it's not a cliff edge, it's a slope. And you can always reduce the damage. It is never too late to make it less bad. And so the apocalyptic idea of like that once you reach a certain point, it's game over. It can be great up to that point in terms of getting people very, very engaged. But then it also risks people thinking, what's the point? Which is what happened psychologically during the Cold War. There were all these studies about how people felt about nuclear weapons. And a lot of the time there was kind of despair and apathy, and sometimes even just a craving, like I'm sick of waiting, bring it on. And I think some people feel like that about climate change. They're just like, get it over with. So it's really quite dangerous apocalyptic language, even though sometimes it can seem like a really useful way of flagging up something urgent.
What's the link between puberty and the apocalypse? Why are there so many kids' books about the apocalypse? So many books for young people about the apocalypse, so many children's stories that are sort of set in the end times, the end of the world, all that sort of thing.
I think part of that might be, I actually haven't really thought that very deeply about this one, but do you know what? I think part of it might be a benign version of the survivalist myth, because survivalism is not a benign culture. It's awful. it's often very, very right-wing men with guns. And the idea is that sort of society is corrupt and confining, and that if everything just goes awfully wrong and society falls apart, then you and your cool mates with your bunker and your guns will sort of rule the earth, and you can be free. And
it's the Tempest.
It's a big theme. I mean, it's a theme in Apocalypse Not where you go back, Day of the Triffids or whatever. This kind of idea, this sort of, oh God, at least I'm liberated from like, I'm not going to get any parking tickets or whatever, like these weird things. And I think that the kind of young adult definitely feel that. There is that kind of thrill of like, it's just you and your crew, and the only rules are the ones you make for yourself. But there's adult versions of that, which generally show how awful it is. And of course, Lord of the Flies, which sort of is an end of the world novel, even though it's not literally about the end of the world. I mean, that shows that things don't always like pan out. But I think there is something in it, in that sort of freedom. And for a similar reason why I think so many books for kids and young adults are about orphans. You don't want parents ruining everything.
It's much easier to write a character who doesn't have parents.
Right.
Much easier.
And this is ultimately, not only do you have parents, but you do not have school, society at all. You're sort of ultimately free. And that's fine in those stories. But with adult stories, it becomes very, very scary. And you get real life survivalists who, get into shootouts with the feds.
Are people more likely to create art about the apocalypse at times of global turmoil, or is there not a link there?
There is, there's definitely a link. It really shifts. Actually, you get very, very little apocalyptic fiction through most of the 19th century, and then towards the end of the 19th century, people are getting very anxious about technological change and political turmoil. And then there's a huge spike. Then after the First World War, you get another wave where everybody's imagining that the next war will literally, destroy humanity. Then obviously after the atomic bomb in 1945, then there's a whole other wave. And then it sometimes seems since that period that there's never not been a crisis. And what's weird is that it really made me rethink the 90s, that it's quite easy to look back at the 90s, whether you lived through it or not, and think it was like, well, it was a time of like generally sort of peace and prosperity and, Britpop and the sitcom Friends. But at the time there was a hysteria because of the millennium.
Yeah.
And various other things, various concerns about technology and there were like a lot of things that people were very freaked out about, a lot of doomsday cults, a lot of movies about the end of the world. So it's not as if there was a time of relative peace and prosperity and people aren't thinking about it. And that's what I found most curious, that there was no ebb and flow. It was essentially that people were thinking about the end of the world all the time.
You spoke quite a bit in your book about the link between, or us talking about apocalypse in sort of satirical or humorous terms, such as Bo Burnham's Inside or the film Don't Look Up. How does satire contribute to our understanding of the apocalypse? And is it something that we're using more of now? Or how has satire always been a theme when people are talking about the apocalypse?
No, satire used to be really quite rare. There's some amazing stuff that quite obscure things, like an amazing Austrian play called The End of the World from the 1930s, which is a satire it's basically a satire of all of humanity based on a comet coming to destroy the world. And it's sort of like a very early version of Don't Look Up. It's kind of weird how similar it is. But it was still quite shocking. Like when Dr. Strangelove came out, the idea of using humor, that Stanley Kubrick didn't start off with the idea that it was going to be funny. He worked his way towards it because he was like, this is the only way he can represent the sort of madness of this. And it was genuinely shocking. A lot of people thought that the ending was just awful. It was just a sort of horrible, sort of childish, nihilist joke. So even it's quite hard to pull off. Kurt Vonnegut's very good at it. But even now, I think what we don't have is so much satire. Is this kind of weird, like, with the Bo Burnham thing, like almost deflated resignation. And one of the things that I worried about when writing the book was whether, the end of the world is just a vibe and you just talk about it like, well, obviously it's going to happen. Like you can just do it in a stand-up comedy show or in a Sally Rooney novel and you go, well, obviously it's the end. And I'm like, is that healthy? Does that help us fix any problems, or is it just a kind of like wry resignation? Which is not to pick on any of these the writers or whatever. But But it does worry me as a symptom.
Do you get a sense of why there's been that almost that tone shift? Is it to do with us, society being sort of less religiously driven and, therefore less worried about upsetting our maker? Or is it something to do with social media and just being bombarded by terrible things all the time? I mean, did you pick up any sort of cultural context for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the religious, obviously that goes back a lot further. There's a relative decline of religion. In some ways, this thinking is a sort of substitute for the biblical version. And what I try to sort of get across is that there are things that we should be worried about. That saying that perhaps we are too obsessed with the end of the world is not to say, global warming doesn't exist and everybody chill, or all the nuclear weapons have disappeared. Like, there's lots of stuff to be worried about, but that is different to that sort of apocalyptic thinking. And I found this amazing phrase from the poet Wallace Stevens in the 1940s, where he talks about the pressure of reality. And he's going, there's so much news these days. Like, this is the 1940s, it's radio, it's the papers. It's very hard to put things into historical context and understand what previous generations were scared of and which of those things, materialized and which didn't. And that phrase, the pressure of reality, I thought, my God, you see it manifesting in like REM, The End of the World as We Know It, in that kind of the dawn of 24-hour TV news. And now that's what we have all the time on our phones. And so it's like really important distinction, which is not to say that people should not be worried about the climate crisis, should not be worried about nuclear weapons, not be worried about AI maybe. But that our media diet is a huge part of that, and it can be a kind of self-perpetuating loop. I mean, that's what we have the word doom scrolling, and I think we should be aware that the media, the information we're consuming, plays a big part of that, and not everything is an objective analysis of the dangers we face.
Did you work out whether we should be frightened of AI destroying the world in the course of writing this book?
Less so. Less so. What I realised, and I think things have changed a little bit in the last couple of years, that people are talking much more now about the threat to people's jobs and the information ecosystem and like really very alive practical things.
And less about the paperclip scenario.
The paperclip maximizer, the Nick Bostrom being the great kind of like sort of prophet of AI doom. And what surprised me again was actually if you go back 100 years to the earliest stories about robots, the earliest stories about computers, before these things existed, it's always about the electronic brain. And if you build an electronic brain, inevitably, this says a lot about humanity, inevitably the electronic brain will want to kill you. It's just like, well, obviously, it's not going to help us, is it? It's obviously going to want to kill us and take over. And so those sort of things play into it. So even though the AI, I don't say hysterics. I'll say hysterics. They don't talk about the Terminator, but it sort of is. It's not dissimilar to the idea of the Terminator. And I do notice that, for example, Elon Musk was one of the first really high-profile people to be worried about the sort of apocalyptic possibilities of AI. And look at where he's headed. And a lot of the time, this kind of language, these kind of fears, are used in quite dangerous ways and can be quite self-serving and socially destructive. So I think it makes much more sense to look at the problems that the immediate problems that we're facing, rather than the kind of more futuristic, far off thing. I would still say be careful while programming your AI. I think that's probably solid advice. Make sure that you can turn it off if it starts going crazy. But yes, it's made me a little more like suspicious of that stuff.
Well, reluctant as I am to bring this discussion to an end, all things must come to an end, Dorian. And please, don't forget to buy this book. It is a fantastic read. And I understand that if you're on some Patreon tiers, you actually get a signed copy. Is that the case, Dorian? So, yeah.
It is. Thank you, Ros. Thank you for interviewing me so I didn't have to write any questions.
It was an absolute pleasure.
I think interviewing myself might be considered a little self-serving. So we have reached the end of the show. And it is time to talk about some of the stories that have gone under the radar this week. Zoe, kick us off.
My under the radar question actually comes from a listener who told us that they had fallen foul of a 3-month passport rule for travelling to Europe because of a new Brexit-related change to travel protocol, which basically meant that they got turned away at the gate because the sort of times about your passport expiring have all changed, and loads of people aren't aware of this. But luckily, my great colleague, Simon Calder, who has appeared on this podcast before, wrote a great article warning us all to check our passports before we go travelling. Because essentially, in our Brexit deal, the UK negotiated for British travellers to become third country nationals. Now, this means that we are now part of the cohort that means we cannot enter the EU on a passport issued over 10 years ago. This essentially means that 200 outbound travellers a day are prevented from departing because they don't know the new EU rules. And an estimated 2.4 million British travellers have documents that can't be used for EU trips because of the change in expiry requirements. So if you are planning to go on holiday soon, make sure you check the new rules and make sure you check the time on your passport that it was issued after May 2014, because if it's issued before that, you may well be out of date, and it means that you won't be able to fly out or get back in.
And the government has just put the price of a new passport up by quite a lot as well.
More good news.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to the listener. If listeners could, in fact, provide all our material in future weeks, that would be great. Ros.
There are reports today that ministers are considering a ban on smartphones for under 16s. What that actually means, because you can't ban smartphones for under 16s, is a ban on under 16s buying smartphones themselves. And this is of many stupid ideas that have come out of this government and attempts to ban things. This is probably the most egregious and the worst, because as everybody who has an under 16 will know, they don't buy their own smartphones. We buy them for them. And because it's a necessity nowadays in modern life pretty much to have a smartphone. And the idea that of banning an under 16 from buying a smartphone is going to solve all the problems that have emerged from social media in the last decade or so it just makes me want to bang my head slowly against the table.
Well, I know that smartphones have, TikTok and Instagram on them, but they are also phones. And I think the reason a lot of people buy phones for their under 16s is so that they can know where they are.
Yeah.
And you can say, oh, are you getting home safely? You know, so unless the government is just, is it just going to launch like government mandated old school Nokias? So you can do the phoning, but you can't go on social media.
Well, some schools are already demanding that. I mean, my son's soon-to-be secondary basically demands that you have an old-school Nokia and you bring it to school. Yeah, although I very much doubt that is enforced in practice, but that's the rule. So
governments like banning things, though. I was listening to something recently, and they were just going, well, look, banning things is really cheap.
Yeah.
And so if you want to look like you're being decisive, but you don't want to spend any money, you just ban something.
Exactly.
Even though the bans don't generally work.
Yeah, whether it's NOx, whether it's vapes, whether it's dangerous dogs, which I actually think should be banned, yeah, absolutely. But it's just a trend in this administration. It has just got to stop.
There's not so much under the radar as breaking news, which is relatively breaking news. President Biden has said that he's considering a request from Australia to drop the prosecution of Julian Assange, which I think is fascinating. And I think Julian Assange himself has kind of gone under the radar for quite a few years. And we don't talk about what's been going on with him enough. I think because there's this sort of broad consensus that he's a terrible dickhead. But it's a while since I wrote about Assange. My position has always been he's a terrible dickhead, but what's happened to him is actually rather terrible, because although he's been guilty of terrible, irresponsible journalism, it is still journalism. And so I think if Biden is going to make that decision, that'll be very interesting politically, because it might make him vulnerable to attack from Trump, certainly, who absolutely wouldn't have done this, I think. But I think it would also be the right move.
Well, one of the things that sometimes put me off Assange, the campaign, even though you're right on the merits of it, was that the sort of sanctification of him. And I just think if they'd really gone on with like he's an asshole, but this isn't right.
Yeah.
I think that would have been quite a compelling message, because people have gone, oh, we don't need to like love the guy.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
It is a point of principle.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think he's a malign individual. I think he's probably been a net bad for the world. That's sort of not the point.
This is good. This is a new technique people should use, protesters should use, I think. I know he's a dick, but bear with me. And it seems mad that this is under the radar, but this is kind of what a lot of people who have been following the war in Sudan think. It's been going on for about a year. You've got the Sudanese armed forces against the Rapid Support Forces, formerly known as the Janjaweed militia, guilty of war crimes and genocide, hooked up with the Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group. They've killed journalists and aid workers and so on. And the death toll so far, relative to both Gaza and the last Darfur crisis in the 2000s, is sort of surprisingly low. At the moment, it's put around 15,000. That may be too low. But what the real damage so far has been is the displacement. The number of people forced to flee the war has now surpassed 8.5 million. Many internally displaced, some seeking refuge abroad. And the UNHCR said thousands are crossing borders daily, as if the emergency had started yesterday. And I'm not into whataboutery. I just want to say, like, it is very strange that there is not more coverage and more concern about what is a massive humanitarian crisis caused by war. And that is the show. Thank you to Ros.
Thank you.
Zoe.
Thank you.
And Hugo.
Thank you very much.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a huge thanks to our generous supporters, new and old, without whom we could not be doing this. Why not join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more for just £3. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how.
Hello, and thanks for your generous support to James Livingston, Luca, Matthias Dombrovski, and Brian Regan.
Big shout from me, and thanks for funding Oh God What Now's nefarious plans to Sean Peacock, Stephen P., Iris, and Katie Cross.
And a massive thanks for backing us, and welcome aboard to Mark Pringle, Jenny, Cressy, and Nikki T.
And welcome home from me to returning supporters Catherine Owen, Michael McCluskey, Andrew Sunderland, and Ben Plumley. See you next time.